All right, Ephesians chapter 5, we're going to be in verses 29 through 33. To get a little more sense of context, because this is really a continuation from last week, I'll start at verse number 25. So I'll read Ephesians 5, 25 through 33. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. I really love a good mystery. I love a good mystery book. I love a good mystery story. And one of the authors that I enjoyed when I was growing up was a woman named Agatha Christie. And Agatha Christie wrote a great number of mystery books, and they were fantastic. It's been interesting because lately some of her books have been revived in movie form. In fact, just this week, I saw a trailer for another one of Agatha Christie's books that's being turned into a movie that's coming out. She wrote amazing characters that, even though I can't even tell you how many years it's been since I last read an Agatha Christie book, but I can still remember some characters like Mrs. Marple and Hercule Poirot, right? These amazing characters in these mystery stories. And despite the fact that when you read an Agatha Christie book, you know that it's a mystery. You know that something's going to happen that's going to be like a twist or a turn. No matter how many times I read them, I'm always trying to figure out ahead of time, well, what's the mystery going to be? Like, what's the twist? And I can never figure it out, which is, I guess, her advantage as a writer, because she's not going to give you all the information you need to figure everything out, right? But as I would read a book, I would rack my brain, what's going to happen? And who's it going to be? Who done it, right? Like, how am I going to figure this out? And I never could. But I love that. I love the engagement of a good mystery. What we have in Ephesians 5 is a discussion of a mystery, and then it says there is a greater mystery. Today, I want to point you to a greater mystery. Our message today continues the idea of living worthy, and unfortunately, we kind of had to stop in mid-thought at last sermon because we only have so much time. Right? And so, because Paul has this extended section to husbands, we're trying to balance here. We're trying to balance being thorough while also keeping things relatively condensed. I say I want to be exhaustive without being exhausted, right? And so you can only sit and listen for so long, and I can only get through so many verses in that amount of time that you can sit and listen. And I think it's good and right for us as a church family to just work our way through throughout our Bibles as we move through the book of Ephesians. We've been moving paragraph through paragraph and seeing what's coming next. And yet sometimes we hit a spot like we are right now where it just didn't feel like we could do this whole paragraph. It's really one paragraph that from 25 down through 33. And it just felt like it was too much to take on. Now obviously in a passage like this, you could stop and all of a sudden you could do a 6-week marriage sermon series or something like that. I want us to stay connected to the text and stay where we are, while at the same time, I really felt like last week we stopped right in the middle of the thought. So to remind you of where we're at, we're in the context of husbands living worthy of the glory of God. Starting in verse number 25. Husbands living worthy of the glory of God was preceded by wives living worthy of the glory of God. And before that, it was everyone live worthy of the glory of God, because that's what's happening in the book of Ephesians. The first 3 chapters painted us this amazing picture of the glory of God shown in Christ through the church forever. And we looked at deep, rich, wonderful doctrine for 3 chapters. And then chapter 4, we moved to not just the glory of God, but what does it mean to live worthy of the glory of God? And beginning in chapter 4, it was good for us to hear. It was applicational in nature, and yet there was a little bit air of generalness to it, right? It was general instruction of living worthy. And then all of a sudden we got to Ephesians 5:22, and what was general just faded away, and Paul got a laser focus, and he said, wives, I want to talk to you. And then he gets a laser focus and he says, husbands, I want to talk to you about living worthy. And in chapter 6, he's going to go, children, I want to have a laser focus. We're not just talking generally about living worthy, but children, what does it look like to live worthy? And then he's going to talk to people who are bondservants. And then he's going to talk to masters. He's getting really specific with us. And so that's what we're in the context of. I want to again encourage you, just because we're in the context of husbands live worthy, to not tune out if you're not in the category of husband, including not tuning out if you're in the category of wife, because really what we're going to see is Paul is going to talk to husbands, but he's moving into marriages living worthy. So there is plenty of information for both husband and wife in these verses. And there's plenty of information for you if you are neither husband nor wife. Because again, Paul is going to say there is a deeper mystery than marriage. I want to encourage you to listen this morning, even if you are not married, because there is a greater mystery that Paul wants you to see and that I want you to see this morning. So you might be young and single, you might be older and single, you might be in midlife, but there is a greater mystery than marriage. What you're going to see from this passage today is that marriage is not ultimate. There is something greater. So I hope that's enough to pique your interest for you to listen, regardless of whether you are husband and wife, because these instructions clearly target husbands and yet matter for all of us. These instructions in verse 25 talk to husbands about how they should love their wives. And the question of how, I mean specifically to what extent. And Paul's answer to this point has been, husbands should love their wives to the extent that Christ loves the church. That's the extent that husbands should love their wives. He's going to add that husbands should love their wives to the extent that they love their own bodies. All right? So you're going to have to follow some logic in these verses to get to our main point, but here's where we're going. Marriages learn from the greater mystery of Christ and the church. Marriages learn from the greater mystery of Christ and the church. And I think these verses break down into these 4 points. Here's the logic of verses 29 through 33. First, people care for their own bodies, and Christ cares for his. And so that we need to understand the care for our own bodies, and then Christ's care for the church. Secondly, we understand the biblical teaching that marriage involves two people becoming one. Thirdly, we get to the point that the greater mystery is not marriage, but Christ and the church. And then finally, we get the application that marriages should learn from the greater mystery. Right? That's where we're headed. Let's do our first point. People care for their own bodies, and Christ cares for his. This is verses 29 and 30. Here it says in verse 29, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. So, in the same way, husbands should love their wives. Because he who loves his wife loves himself. That's really where we came to an end last week. And so I want you to see is that's really in the middle of the thought. So where we left last week was this thought that husbands love their wives because their wives are their own bodies. That was really the logic of where he's going. Because your wife is your own body, if you love your wife, you love yourself. And then our verse number 29, for, that shows you he's making an argument. So we left off right before Paul started giving you the reason that a wife is her husband's body, that they are one. Right? And so here's his explanation. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it. No one ever hated. That word hated is a particular kind of verb that indicates that it is a general operating principle. Right? No man typically goes on hating himself. It's not a way that they operate throughout the day. Now, are there exceptions to that? Well, if they are really, really few. If there are exceptions to anybody hating himself, I can hardly think of them. So you might say, well, what about people, it's become something that's become much more public and people are much more aware of. What about people that practice things like cutting? Isn't that hating their own flesh? And the answer is no. Somebody that practices that loves themselves deeply, cares so much that they try to control their life that they would do something that ends up hurting their body. What about people that are ashamed of their weight? Isn't that like they hate their own flesh? They're like, oh, I'm so embarrassed that this is what I weigh. Listen, if you didn't care about your body, you wouldn't care how much your body weighed. Right? You love your own flesh. So somebody that says, I'm so ashamed about my weight, that's somebody who loves their own flesh. Right? Even all the way to the tragic end of suicide, those are still people that say, I'm most important. Right? And this is the only thing I think I can do but it's still, I'm the most important thing in my life. Right? I think all people actually love themselves deeply, this deep down abiding sense of care. We don't hate our flesh. There is this sense that instead we nourish and cherish it. So this is a general principle. Nobody hates themselves, but we nourish and cherish our own bodies. That word nourish has some of the idea of feeding, and cherish has the idea of a tender care. Right? That's how we treat our bodies. We nourish it, we give it food, and we give it tender care. I found a 2020 Groupon survey about American men. I accidentally flashed it up a little bit earlier. Maybe you saw that. According to this 2020 survey, the average American man spends, any guesses on per month? Now, I don't know what you would think. The average American male spends per month on caring for themselves. So this would include things like gym memberships, vitamin supplements, shaving supplies, all that kind of stuff. All right, so get a number in your brain. If you didn't already see it when I accidentally put it up, get a number in your brain. What do you think the average American male spends per month on nourishing and cherishing themselves? According to this Groupon survey, the answer is $244 a month. All right? Now, I don't know if some of you are contributing to that number or if you are dragging it down. I feel like I might be dragging that number down because I feel like 244 is a pretty high number. That's almost $3,000 a year, and we're not even talking about things like food, right? Guys love to nourish and cherish their bodies. We're not even talking about feeding. We're not talking about clothing. Right? We're talking about guys buying clothes. We're not talking about the things that guys love to get for their bodies, like the vehicle to ride around in. Right? All we're talking about is just that, like the stuff to take care of your body. Listen, no one, and specifically no male, is really the point in 29, ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it. Right? William Henderson is a commentator, and he said this. I thought it was pretty humorous. Paul is, however, not thinking only of supplying the body with barely enough food, clothing, and shelter to enable it to eke out a mere existence. He refers instead to the bounteous, elaborate, unremitting, and sympathetic care we bestow on our bodies. That's a good picture, right? Of this nourishing and cherishing. It's not, will I have enough food to survive? It's, I want lots of care on my body, right? Nourishing and cherishing. And Paul's point is, this is the way of all people, regardless of what their body might even look like. A much older commentator and pastor named Charles Hodge, I wanted to put this quote here too, just because I find this also really funny and extremely true. A man may have a body which does not altogether suit him. He may wish it were handsomer. Is that even a word? Charles Hodge was a long time ago. He said it, so it must be a word. But he might wish it were handsomer, healthier, stronger, or more active. Still, it is his body. It is himself. And he feeds it and cherishes it as tenderly as if it were the best and most lovely in the world. Right? I love the description of, hey, a guy might have a body that it doesn't totally suit him. He might wish it were different, but he still thinks it's the best and most lovely in the world. Right? Paul's point, one that we can relate to, and one that even Hodge would then go on to make this point is, now that applies to wives. That applies to how a husband looks at his wife. And Hodge even took it all the way to all of those lengths of saying, a husband may have a wife that does not altogether suit him. He might wish that she were more beautiful, healthy, strong, or active. Still, he would say, this passage teaches us that she is his body, and he should treat her tenderly as if she were the best and most lovely in the world. That's where this passage is going. No one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. What an amazing thought. How does Christ feel about you as the church? How does he feel about Christ Community Church? How does he feel about the other local churches in our community? How does he feel about churches in Ripon and Modesto and Manteca? And what about churches in Arizona and Nevada? And what about churches in Asia and in Africa? What does Jesus think? Just as Christ nourishes and cherishes the church. Christ's perspective of the church is, this is something that I feed and I cherish. I value it. I care for it. I love it. Why? It says it so casually, but this is such a deep thought for us. Because, why does he nourish and cherish the church? Because we are what? We are members of his body. It just casually states it. But how amazing is that? You are a member of Jesus' body. I would get it if our Bibles told us that we were subjects of Jesus. I would even say it would be really nice if we could just be lowly peasants. That's all we could be, is just be a lowly peasant. That would be amazing. If the Bible said that every now and then we were sometimes a useful tool, I would say, what a privilege. But do you see what this passage does? We are a part of his very body. I never would have thought to claim that for myself. I never would have thought that's something that we could have as poor, broken sinners, that we would not just be saved from our sin, but what? I would be a part of him, a part of his body. I would belong to him. He would care for me. He would nourish and cherish me. This elevates far beyond any expectation we would have apart from the gospel of how Jesus looks at you this morning. So listen, brother or sister, how does Christ look at you right now? You are his body. He nourishes you. He cherishes you. You might be in one of those times where you feel like Christ seems so far away. His care for me, does it seem distant to you? Are you sitting here this morning and you feel like maybe you're under the condemnation of God and you're always messing up and you're always doing the wrong thing, and can he still love you? Hear from this passage, if you are in Christ, you are his body. He nourishes and cherishes you. He could no more cut you off. He could no more ignore you and hate you than you could your own body. You are in him. What a sweet truth. He nourishes and cherishes us as the church. People care for their own bodies, and Christ cares for his. Interesting that Paul doesn't just say he cares for the church. He says Christ does for the church because we are members of his body. I love it that Paul includes himself at this point. We're members of his body because that also includes all of us who are in Christ. We all. It includes Paul, and as I was reminded this week, it includes Paul, the prisoner. Have you forgotten that he's in prison while he's been writing this? Because I have often forgotten it during this book. Paul has so regularly pointed us to the greatness of God and the wonder of the church and how much he's loved and cared for by God that I have forgotten that he is rotting in prison as he writes these words. Listen, Paul does not connect his circumstance of being in prison and say, it must be that Christ does not care for me. Paul doesn't say, my circumstances are bad, therefore I'm not being nourished and cherished. Paul doesn't say, Christ, if you are going to prove to me that you love me, you must give me all of the happiness I've longed for. You must give me my freedom. You must give me my health. You must give to me, or else I'm not sure you love me. No, Paul, in the midst of prison, says, I am nourished and cherished. We are members of his body. And Paul's position as prisoner did not interfere with his position as loved by Christ. Right? All right. We care for our own bodies, and Christ cares for his. But secondly, we need to move on in the logic of this passage to see that marriage involves two people becoming one. Because it doesn't just say we're members of his body. He's going to show you that this was God's intention in marriage, this idea of oneness. All right? Marriage involves two people becoming one. That's verse 31. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's in quotes in the ESV that I'm looking at, because it's taken from Genesis 2:24, and it pretty much is a direct quote from Genesis 2:24. And really, the Genesis 2:24 is the basis for our understanding and practice of marriage. And Jesus taught this as well. So in Mark chapter number 10, Jesus is going to use the same passage to talk about the oneness in marriage. They were having a discussion about divorce, and Jesus' answer to the people that were arguing with him in Mark 10 is, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So Jesus is well aware of Genesis 2:24. Lord willing, we're going to go through Genesis 1 through 11 when we're finished with Ephesians, and I guess I'll make that point then too, but I might as well make it here. Jesus doesn't treat Genesis 2 like it's some kind of allegory or myth. Jesus teaches Genesis 2 like it's authoritative words from God and is real, actual history, right? But so he quotes it, and he says, "So, because that's true, because Genesis 2:24, then husband and wife are no longer two, but one flesh." And he makes this connection to lifelong marriage. "What therefore God is joined together, let not man separate." Right? The point here is of oneness. People care for their own bodies, and Christ cares for his own body. And why are husband and wife one body? It's because of Genesis 2:24 and how God created marriage and what he made it to be. Right? He says, "A man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." That the leaving is a necessary part. Leaving mother and father. It has the idea of leaving that family unit. Now, in Jewish culture, they left that family unit and they didn't leave it very far, as they would build on to the house or wherever they're living, and they just kind of they just kept expanding, right? But the point was, you're no longer underneath mother and father in their rules and their being in charge. You've left that. You've created a new family unit. Okay? I just think from a practical wisdom standpoint, it's not always a great idea to continue living underneath the same roof as mother and father. And in my experience, I have rarely seen that go very well. I normally think that leaving father and mother should probably include a little bit of distance, even if it's just the house next door or the house the next block over. In Kathy and I's case, the house 2,000 miles away. But there is a leaving, right? There needs to be a separation. There's a different family now. That's part of marriage. Because there's a new relationship between husband and wife that doesn't exist between them and their parents. Right? And a lot of times, especially early on, when it's maybe the first couple of kids to get married, it can be very difficult for parents to work through, this is my child, but now my child has this whole new relationship with somebody else that now we have never had the same relationship. Right? The relationship between parent and child is not the same as the relationship between husband and wife, because husband and wife become one flesh. That's never said about families. That's never said about parents and children, that they are somehow one. No, it's a unique relationship. So you have to leave mother and father and then hold fast to his wife. That word hold fast has the idea of glued together. I was going to say cemented together, and then I was thinking, well, of course, back then they didn't have cement, so I don't want to say that that's what the word meant. They didn't have cement back then, but you know how good cement works, right? I mean, good cement sticks stuff together. I remember making we were making soccer goals. I loved soccer when I was growing up, and we got some nets from the local high school. They were just going to throw them out, even though they were perfectly good. So we're like, hey, we'll take your nets, and then we got tires. And we went to the lumber store and we got posts, and we filled those tires with cement, and we stuck the post into the tire, and then we hung our soccer nets on them. And so my whole growing up, we always had soccer goals in our front yard. I loved it. But there's something about cement. You stick that post in, right? And those things didn't move, right? In fact, the night that I was running full speed away from my brother in the dark and forgot about those posts and ran headfirst into that post, guess who won? Did the post win or did I win? My face. It was the post that won, and my face was right down the center. You can imagine what happened when I ran into a post that was cemented, right? The cement worked, right? It kept it held together. That's this idea of held together. But they would have used the concept of glued together. There actually was various ways that they would use glues, or similar to glue, back then. Has the idea of joined together, and you can't pull it apart. Obviously, they didn't have super glue back then. I don't know if you've ever done that thing where you put super glue on your fingers, and then you go, uh-oh, I waited too long, and now I can barely get them apart. That's this point. You hold fast to your wife. You're joined together. There's this. You can't pull it apart, right? That's marriage. A man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the result is the two become one flesh. Right? So if we don't have the same understanding of Christian marriage, then we miss Paul's point about oneness. His whole point is husband and wife are one. Husband loves his wife like she's his body because she is. Like you're one. Husband and wife are one. Right? I think there's no doubt that there are elements of a sexual overtone in that. That's absolutely the way God made our sexual relationship is part of what he's talking about. You can see that in 1 Corinthians 6, 16 and 17, when he says, "Do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh." So clearly there's an element that this includes the sexual relationship, but it's not exclusive to it. Right? Sex is not marriage. But it is oneness. It is oneness. This is amazing insight into how a husband and wife are emotionally, relationally, personally joined together. There's oneness. Right? And so when we understand marriage involves two people becoming one, then we're able to start understanding something about Christ and the church. Our marriage, our culture says all kinds of things about marriage, right? There are a gazillion different ideas of what marriage is or how it works, but it is a particularly Christian view of marriage that says marriage is a male and a female joining for their entire lives, being inseparably joined and becoming one. This is not, it's a different way of understanding being roommates. Right? Or, hey, this is a friendship. Marriage is just a friendship. I mean, marriage ought to include friendship, right? But it's not marriage is just a friendship. Marriage is not just friendship. Marriage is oneness, right? Marriage is two people becoming one in a way that never happens with any other friend in your life, right? Marriage is not just friendship. Marriage is not cohabitation. We live in the same place at the same time. Right? Marriage is not a convenient social arrangement so that you can raise some children or, pay less taxes because you can file jointly. No, marriage is oneness. It's two people becoming one. And that Christian view of marriage is going to help you, if that's in your mind and you have that understanding, that's going to help you get to our third point. And our third point is the greater mystery is actually not marriage. But the greater mystery is Christ and the church. He says in verse 32, this mystery is profound. And I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. He says there's a mystery and it's profound. That word mystery, the Latin word that was used to translate that is a word that in English became sacrament. So, for instance, whenever the Roman Catholic Church teaches that marriage is a sacrament, they took that from the Latin of this word mystery. But this word mystery doesn't have it doesn't have any of the sacramental overtones that we would see within Roman Catholic theology. It doesn't have the concept of something that gives you grace, something that is infusing grace. The mystery, I think, is in keeping with what we've already talked about of mystery in the book of Ephesians. What we've already covered as a mystery in the book of Ephesians is that there are realities that are shadowed in our Old Testaments that are then revealed in the New. It's something that was hidden until we were given more information. Right? So when he says this mystery is profound, and I'm saying it refers to Christ and the church, what Paul is doing is saying there's something amazing about marriage. And there is an element of mystery in how two people can become one. Right? Because even in me trying to say that, like marriage is a husband and wife becoming one, I'm not even sure that I can fully even use words to describe an experience that if you are married, I hope you have had. That I don't know any other thing to say other than oneness. It is this, we love one another, but it's not just that. It's also, we're connected, and I don't know, marriage is like, I literally cannot even think about my life apart from Kathy. Like, there is no point that I'm not a married person. Like, I don't like, just because we're not in the same room doesn't mean that like somehow I now feel like I did back when I was single. Like, I'm still like married. Everywhere I go, I'm married. It doesn't matter what I'm doing, I'm married. It's part of who I am. It's like now it's not just me, it's us. Marriage is this oneness, it's two becoming one. That's profound, and I'm not sure that I can plumb the depths of that whole mystery, but Paul goes, but actually there's a greater mystery here. And what's more profound is that Christ and the church was hidden in Adam and Eve and the creation of marriage. Christ in the church was the greater reality. And so when we read Genesis 2:24, if it weren't for later revelation, we never would have gotten from Genesis 2:24 to Christ in the church, right? It was hidden. But what was baked into a husband leaving father and mother and clinging to his wife and becoming one with her, what was baked into that in God's intention was Christ in the church. It's the greater mystery. We understand Genesis 2:24 in a deeper way even than Moses would have, because we see more that it applies to and more that it points to. The ultimate reality in this passage is not marriage, but Christ and the church. And I say that, I would never want to bring marriage down in our viewpoint. Our culture does more than enough to bring marriage down, to make it look less important. But at the same time, I feel like I need to make this point to us this morning. There is a very real danger, even for us as a church that loves marriage, that loves Christian marriage, that values it, that promotes it. There is a very real danger, I think, of idolatry when it comes to marriage. I'm certainly not meaning to demean or diminish marriage, and God's word doesn't. But we do need a proper perspective of marriage. So when I say that there is a greater reality than marriage, there is a more ultimate reality, that's not to make marriage somehow look down. That's to say how much greater is Christ and the church. Because our marriages can't bear the weight of providing ultimate happiness. They can't do it. Your spouse can't be your Messiah. He or she can't give you everything you need. That's not possible. It's not an elevation of marriage that makes it the most important thing in your life. It's the misuse of it. So if marriage is like ultimate in your brain, that's the thing that's going to bring you happiness. That's the thing that is going to end your loneliness. That's the thing that is going to be amazing. I'm just guaranteeing you, you're going to be disappointed because every idol disappoints. Only God can fully satisfy. Only God is ultimate. And so what this passage is doing is not making us look down on marriage, but making us look up to the greater mystery of Christ and the church. A Christian worldview sees God alone as ultimate and is then able to enjoy the good gifts he provides, like marriage, in all of its fullness. But if we're going to enjoy marriage to its fullness, we have to set it in its proper perspective, which is that the greater mystery is not marriage, as wonderful as it is. The greater mystery is Christ and the church. It is amazing. It is mysterious. It is profound. It is wonderful that Christ would set his affection on you, that he would love you, that he would become one with you. Listen, you are unified with Christ. And I want you to think about this morning, again, without making marriage look lower. You are unified with Christ in a way that you will never be, whether you are married or if you are married right now or you're married at a later point. You are unified with Christ in a way that you will never be with a spouse. You will be unified with Christ in a deeper, spiritual, eternal way than you ever will be on an earthly standpoint. As wonderful as the earthly one is. Paul's not saying the earthly one isn't wonderful. He just says there's a deeper reality, a more profound one that is with Christ. The greater mystery is not marriage, but it's Christ and the church. Paul is lifting up how we see Christ in the church, Christ and us. All right. But our final point this morning, it's almost like Paul goes back to, okay, but I still do want to talk to marriages, right? And you see that in verse 33 when he says, however, he wants you to see how wonderful it is, Christ in the church. He wants you to see the greater mystery. He wants you to be amazed by Christ in the church. Whether you are single or married, old or young, we ought to be amazed and thankful and blessed by Christ in the church in this relationship. But he still does have practical application for us, right? So he gets to verse 33 and he's like, okay, back to the idea of marriage. Marriages do need to learn from the greater mystery. However, he says, let each one of you men love his wife. It's built down. No, it doesn't say men. Let each one of you, but the implication is clear. Let each one of you, husband, love his wife as himself. And let the wife see that she respects her husband. He gets back to marriage and he says, let each one of you. No exceptions to this, guys. So if you're married here this morning, this is for you. Each one of you, love your wife as yourself. The call to love your wife as yourself is not to some kind of spiritual elite. This is not like, yes, someday I hope to aspire to be a Christian man that eventually that figures out how to love his wife. No, every single one of you. This is not leaders in the church. You should love your wife. No, this is each one of you. This is not. I have a wonderful wife and we have a fantastic relationship, and so I love her. No, this is each one of you. This is not, hey, I've been married for 27 years, 37 years, 47 years, and so I've learned to love my wife. No, this is each one of you. This is whether you've been married for 6 weeks or 50 years. Each one of you, men, should love your wife. When it says love your wife, each one of you love his wife, that it is exclusive. Love, you could say, love your own wife. There's an exclusivity to loving your wife. Let each one of you love his wife. Men, there is no room for flirting or eyeing other women in Christian marriage. You love your own wife. Everybody knows what it is to have that slightly flirtatious word, or that second look, or that bordering on the edge of inappropriate Facebook message. And all of that is out of place in Christian marriage, because husbands should love their wives, not anybody else. Love your wife is an exclusive commitment. That love of your wife should include all of her. What do I mean by that? Husbands, you should love your wife and who she is physically. Your wife is a physical being, and so you should love her. You should care for who she is physically. You should care for her whether she is feeling sick or she is feeling healthy. You should care for her whether you are young or whether you are older. You should care for her whether you look the same as you did in your wedding photos or you don't look anything like your wedding photos anymore, right? We love our wives physically because God made them physical beings, right? There are sometimes, some of you might say this is incredibly unromantic, in which case, I'm sorry. I guess you can talk with Kathy about this, but I feel like we're doing okay. There's this objective thing about beauty. I think beauty is something that is objective, right? Beauty is not just a subjective thing. Some people say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but I just think that's postmodern nonsense. There's a thing that there is beauty and there is not beauty, right? And there are ways that even physically we might change over time. So I hate to admit it, but I'm able to see in the mirror, and I no longer look exactly the way I did some years ago. You know what I tell my wife sometimes? I don't say, you're the most beautiful woman in the world, right? So if you feel like that's unromantic, I'm sorry about that. But you know what I tell my wife? You're the most beautiful woman in the world to me, right? That applies whether we were 27 and we got married at 22 and 21. She's the most beautiful woman in the world to me at 22 as we are now at 42. Right? There's no other woman's beauty that I desired in hers. Right? That's the point. You're the most beautiful person in the world to me. It doesn't matter if your beauty is the same as what it was at 22. Right? The point is you. I love you and your physical being. Right? I might say it's way more romantic to say you're the most beautiful person in the world. I'm not the most beautiful person in the world. I'm not the most handsome person in the world, right? So there's no use me pretending that, and I don't need my wife to tell me you're the most handsome person in the world, because I know I'm not. So it's okay, right? But she's the most beautiful person in the world to me because I love her for who she is, even physically, right? Husbands, love your wives, who they are physically, but our wives are not just physical beings. Our wives have a heart. We've said this over and over again here at our church, so I hope when I say heart, you immediately think of the three things that are biblical categories of our heart. Our heart is our thinking, and our feeling, and our choosing. Husbands, you need to love your wife's heart. In other words, you care about the way that she thinks. You may not always understand the way she thinks, but you ought to care about what she thinks. Our thinking is an expression of our beliefs. So what is it that your wife believes is important? Part of loving your wife is, I know what she thinks is important, and I care. I nourish and cherish. Your wife is not just a thinking being, she is a feeling being. She has emotions that express her values. So husbands, do you love your wife's values? Her heart? Do you the things that she cares about, are you willing to care about that as well? Do you care about what she's feeling? Our hearts are not just our thinking and our feeling, our hearts are also our choosing, the things that we're committed to. So husbands, love your wife's heart, including in her choices. Husbands, love your wife Love the woman who God gave you as a relationship. Care about her relationally. I hope we made this point abundantly clear last week, but let me make it again this week, because we preached 2 weeks ago on wives submit to your own husbands. But listen, men, your wife's respect to you ought to be as a lover, not as a tyrant. Right? It says husbands love. It doesn't say husbands rule, husbands dominate, husbands force wife to submit. It says husbands love. So your wife's relationship to you ought to be on the basis of love. Wives are told to submit, but husbands, you are told to love. John Calvin said it this way: the husband's authority, their authority, should rather be a companionship than a kingship. So if any of you got a little bit confused when we read wives submit, let me try to undo that. This is about companionship, husband. You love your wife. You don't rule as king over her. All right, that's commands for husband. Let each one of you love his wife as himself. What is that now? The fourth time that he said as Christ, as your own body, as yourself. And a final command for wives. And let the wife see that she respects her husband. Let the wife see that she respects her husband. It's a word that can be translated fear, but I think that takes us in the wrong direction because of how we think of fear. The point is, I think respect is a good translation for that word. The point is, I am willing to let you lead. I'm willing to respect your leadership. I'm willing to follow. So instead of fighting, I will follow. I will respect. I think that's the concept of fear or putting under. Wives, I want to encourage you that if you expect little from your husband, you will probably get it. If you respect and trust and allow, you'll probably get that too. Right? You'll get leadership. So if you go, yeah, he's not going to take the lead, so I will. You know what a lot of guys are going to do? Okay, sure, go for it. You don't want to respect my leadership? Then have at it. I'm not saying that's good or right. It's wrong. That's wrong. So to be clear, that's wrong. Guys, don't do that. Right? I'm just saying, if you respect little in terms of leadership and love, then that's probably what you'll get. Men, we need to rise to the challenge of biblically loving our wives, and yet all too often we sink to low expectations. And so, wife, if you have a low respect for your husband, you assume he is incompetent or incapable, your husband will sink to that level, most likely. It is hard to live out these kind of household rules that Paul has laid out for us. It is hard whether you're a husband who has to learn to love his wife as himself. It's hard, wives, to be able to live out seeing that she respects her husband, especially those times when you think he doesn't really deserve respect, or he's dropping the ball on this and I'm having a hard time respecting him. It's hard for us to do this. And to do this, we're going to have to die to self. We will need to lay down our lives for the other. And in that, we're also following the example of Christ. It can be painful to love like Christ does. Christ loved and he gave himself up for the church. So let me remind you, husbands and wives, as you think about these profound commands for what our relationships and our roles look like in our marriage, let me remind you that you are looking to Christ, you're looking to his relationship to the church. If you've noticed throughout these last couple of weeks, I've tried to avoid saying that marriage is a picture of Christ in the church. Have you noticed that? At no point have I said marriage is a picture of Christ in the church. Why? Because it's the other way around. Christ and the church are the example for marriage. Which one is Paul holding up to teach the other? He is holding up Christ and the church to teach marriages. Right? I know what people mean when they say marriage is a picture of Christ in the church. We just have to remember that that's kind of backwards, though. At no point here does he say, do you want to know what Christ in the church looks like? Then look at marriage. No, that's the wrong way to go about it. Look at the example that's been laid before us in Christ and the church, and then apply that, bring that in to our understanding of marriage. All right, so let's conclude with some applicational thoughts this morning as we come to an end. First point of application. Do you know how Christ feels about the church? And I mean to stress that word know. Do you know how Christ feels about the church? As in, do you know that, not just mentally, well, first of all, mentally, do you mentally know how Christ feels about the church? Do you know his nourishing and cherishing for the church? Like, do you know mentally Jesus loves and cares about the church and he poured out his life for her and she's precious to him? Do we know that? And there's some people that have so unfortunately torn down the church as either irrelevant or immaterial or unnecessary. The church is just like, why do we even need to have organized church? They've torn it so down that we've started to lose our understanding of how Christ cares about the church. Do you know mentally how Christ cares about the church? Meaning also you. But do you not just know mentally how Christ feels about the church? Do you know it experientially? Like has it sunk from your head to like, yeah, Christ loved the church and gave himself for her, to Christ loved me and he gave himself up for me? Like, have you experienced how Christ feels for the church? Do you know? Do you know what Christ does to care for us? Do you know it? Mentally, but experientially, do you know how Christ feels about the church? All right, a second application thought for you to consider. Maybe this is for you this morning. Have you leaved and cleaved? I don't know, those are real words either, but leaving and cleaving, left and cleft. Have you leaved and cleaved? I want to encourage you to that, whether you were early in marriage or late. I still remember, there are a few things I remember about our actual wedding ceremony. The wedding ceremony was kind of a blur. I don't know if those of you are married, I don't know how much you remember the actual ceremony. There are some things I remember, like how incredibly orange the church building was. It was really, really orange. Like the pews were orange, the curtains were orange, the carpet was orange. It was really orange. So I remember that. But I also remember as Kathy's dad walked her down and got to the point where they, who gives this woman to be married to this man? And, he said her mother and I. And he opened his suit jacket. And on the inside, he's kind of a joker, Kathy's dad. And on the inside of his jacket, he had a piece of paper pinned to the inside of his suit. And it said, "Leave and cleave or else." And that's what he showed inside his jacket, and then he buttoned it back up again and nobody else saw it. Leave and cleave, or else. Leaving and cleaving is good and right. So have you leaved and cleaved? It's an important part of marriage in developing your oneness. All right, third application. Is your perspective of your marriage in the right place? Your perspective of marriage. Do you cherish marriage without idolizing it? Is there a chance that you're looking to marriage for ultimate fulfillment? Right? Is there a chance that you've seen marriage, whether you are married or you're not married? Do you look at marriage as this, well, that's where my happiness is going to come. That's where my joy in life is. This is what is going to complete me. Right? I love the point of oneness, and there was some movie, right, where somebody said, like, you complete me. And it's all, like, romantic and everything. But listen, if you think that marriage is going to be what finally makes you a better person, what is finally going to be like, well, now I am whole, you are going to be sorely disappointed. Right? We have this wrong, romanticized view, even within the Christian church. We put our spiritual Christian spin on it, and because we love marriage, and we say marriage is the be all end all. Do you have the right perspective? If you're looking to marriage for ultimate fulfillment, you will be disappointed whether you are married or not. And on the other extreme, you can be just as sinful in ignoring your marriage or the concept of marriage. Right? We must neither hold it up as our God, nor must we sink marriage to the low levels that it is in our culture. Do you have the right perspective of marriage? Is it in the right spot? All right, and then some applications for husband and wife as we're done with our application. Husband, how can you grow in your love for your wife? I want you to think about this. What are ways that you can grow in your love for your wife? Probably lots of different ways to answer that, but here's a couple. Maybe you could ask her. You could ask her, what are some ways that you would feel my love more? How could I grow in my love for you? And she might start talking about something relational. She might talk about something emotional. She might talk about something mental. She might talk about a choice. She might talk about who she is physically. But maybe ask your wife, how can I grow in my love for you? All right? So husbands, I can give you maybe two pieces of homework. Number one, ask your wife, how can I grow in my love for you? And number two, maybe you should ask one other godly man that you respect. Maybe you should go to another godly man, whether in this room or elsewhere, that you respect, and you ask him that question, how can I grow in my love for my wife? And see what counsel you get from a godly person. But husbands, we ought to be growing in our love for our wife. Right? It says, husband, love your wife, so how can we grow in that? All right. Speaking of a godly man you might respect, there's that word respect. So speaking of respect, wife. How can you grow in your respect for your husband? If it's commanded, and it is, let the wife see that she respects her husband. What are ways that you can grow in your respect for your husband? Well, to you as well. Maybe you can have a conversation with your husband. Maybe ask your husband, does he know that you respect him? Right? Now, you might don't just do this right after the service. You might need to buckle up because who knows what the answer is going to be. But you need to prepare a time when you can sit down and say, husband, do you know I respect you? If you want to try to live this passage out, and you say I am committed to obeying this. Wife sees she respects her husband. Husband, do you feel like I respect you? Right? And how do you know that I respect you? Right? How? All right? These are things that we can do to practical application to grow in living out these household commands. Love your wife as yourself, husband. Wife, respect your husband. But all of us, remember the greater mystery. It's Christ and the church. And that's for you, male or female, married or unmarried. Christ loved you and gave himself for you. So let's rejoice and live in that reality this week. All right, let's pray.